For those living through it was a time of madness, a time of horror and hope, a time when all creation got turned on its head and the unthinkable became possible. Erupting in 1642, the First English Civil War pitted the forces of Parliament against the autocratic monarch Charles I in a showdown over the rights of kings and of commoners. But while it may have begun as a localized conflict on one rainy island, it soon span off into something much broader. As the fighting raged, consuming not just England but also Scotland and Ireland, brand new ideas sprang up that would impact the Western world. Military innovations, yes, but also social movements that pushed forward radical notions that prefigured the coming Enlightenment. Yet even as these new horizons were opening, a dark counterforce was rising, a force that would soon place England under a puritanical dictatorship, even as it unleashed horror in Ireland. Today, we're going to dive into the first of the English Civil Wars, the 1640s and 1650s, and explore the rise of their most talented and infamous son, Oliver Cromwell. Today, the British Isles are home, for now at least, to two sovereign states, the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Back when our video is set, though, this wasn't the case. Instead of two nations occupying the islands, there were three. The Kingdom of England, which included Wales, the Kingdom of Scotland, and the Kingdom of Ireland, with Ireland effectively ruled as an English colony. Yet these three very different states had one thing in common: a king. One king to rule them all. And as the dark days of the English Civil War dawned, that king was none other than Charles I, the son of Scottish King James VI, who, just to be confusing, had also taken over England in 1603 as James I. Charles was only the second ever monarch to unite all British kingdoms in personal union. Unfortunately, he would be so singularly incompetent, stubborn, and deluded that he would wind up plunging all three of them into war. Yep, all three. Despite this video being entitled The First English Civil War, it's going to unavoidably feature a whole lot of chaos simultaneously happening in Scotland and Ireland. But since we'll hopefully dig deeper into those parallel wars in future videos, our focus today is going to be on Charles's largest kingdom, which also happened to be the one he had the worst relationship with. From the moment Charles ascended to the English throne in 1625, it was clear that trouble was brewing. As a human being, Charles was apparently rather shy and sweet. As a king, though, he was the stuff of early 17th century nightmares. For one thing, he was married to a Catholic in an era when most English adults could still recall Catholics trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605. For another, Charles's personal beliefs seemed to mostly revolve around the divine right of kings and how balls out awesome it was to just keep on raising taxes. Now, this was a problem because only England's Parliament could authorize tax hikes, and MPs were more concerned about Charles trying to rule like a god. This led to an unfortunate situation where the king kept calling Parliament and demanding they raise taxes, only for Parliament to instead exercise its other right to make speeches calling the king an old-timey penis. At which point, Charles would exercise his right to dissolve Parliament, and the whole sorry process would just start all over again. And by the way, taking a shot every time Charles dissolves Parliament in this video? Dangerous stuff. You'll get really drunk. In fact, what we'll do, we'll put a little Charles dissolves Parliament counter down there. It'll ting every time he dissolves Parliament, and you can take a shot or don't. That would be irresponsible. In both 1625 and 1626, again, Charles dissolved parliaments. Each time, though, he was forced to recall them to help fund his foreign wars. Things came to a head in 1629 after one of the king's closest advisors was assassinated while Parliament was in session, trying to impeach that same advisor. Blaming the impeachment process, Charles dissolved Parliament for a third time. This time, though, he wouldn't call a new one for 11 long years. For Charles's supporters, the following period was known as the era of personal rule, with Charles using officers of state to rule by decree. To his opponents, though, they became known as the 11 Years of Tyranny. That's because Charles still needed to raise taxes, but since only Parliament had the power to do so, he got a little bit creative with his methods, let's say. There was ship money, a long-standing tax on seaside towns to help pay for the navy, which Charles decided to also impose on inland towns. Or that time he also dug out a long-forgotten 13th century document that required all freeholders to attend a king's coronation and then fined everyone who hadn't attended his. By the late 1630s, most of Charles's English subjects were absolutely furious. Not that the king cared very much, though. So long as he never had to call another parliament, he'd never have to listen to their bloody complaining. Unfortunately for the king, though, never was going to come sooner than he realised, because by 1640, Charles was going to have made the spectacularly stupid decision to wreck his finances, going to war with another one of his kingdoms. And Scotland was going to make sure that the king paid oh so dearly for picking a fight with them. At the same time he was ruling England as a one-man show, Charles was also pushing ahead with plans to bring his kingdoms closer. Specifically, he wanted to force worshippers across England, Scotland, and Ireland to use the same liturgy, an idea that he cooked up with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. The trouble was, Charles and Laud were both suspected of being secret Catholics, and the liturgy they settled on appeared to suspicious Protestants to be akin to papish idolatry. In 1637, the king imposed this new liturgy on Scotland with zero consultation and very little warning. That went about as well as telling Scottish people what to do generally does, and all summer there were riots in Edinburgh. In the aftermath, most of Scotland's great and good got together and swore something known as the National Covenant, a vow to protect their Presbyterian faith. It should have been a warning to Charles to back down before things got serious. But the king didn't see a warning, he just saw another challenge to his authority. A challenge that immediately brought out his inner Karen. Mustering an army, Charles did the military equivalent of demanding to see the manager, marching north to put Scotland in its place, only for the Scots to instead stick their tartan boot right up his royal arse. Taking place in 1639 and 1640, the Bishops' Wars ended not with Scotland's Covenanters victorious, but with their army now occupying parts of northern England. Defeated, desperate, and utterly broke, the humiliated Charles was forced to do something he'd sworn he'd never do again. In April 1640, he called a new parliament. Perhaps in the back of the king's mind, there was hope that things had changed after 11 years. Perhaps he saw how the Irish Parliament raised an army to fight the Scots and hoped the English would do the same. Instead, the 1640 Parliament basically convened, frowned at its crinkled old notes from 1629, cleared its throat, and declared, as we were saying on the subject of you being a You see, it turns out many MPs were sympathetic to the Covenanter cause, and even those who weren't couldn't pass up an opportunity to harangue Charles for the last 11 years. So the king did what the king did best. He dissolved Parliament. Fourth time. But this didn't stop the issue of the Scottish army squatting in Newcastle, shouting, "Hey, a bunch of Jessies!" Terrible Scottish accent, I know, my apologies. So that November, Charles was forced to call another parliament. And good news for anyone playing our drinking game, this is it. This is the parliament that Charles would never dissolve. Known as the Long Parliament, it lasted 8 whole years, the first of which were spent almost exclusively messing with the king. Under MP John Pym, the Long Parliament refused to raise money to fight Scotland without first reclaiming all of those rights that the king had snatched away. Well, this meant Charles being forced to sit there bitterly as his allies like Archbishop Laud were impeached, as Pym and the Commons abolished all the officers that had helped sustain personal rule, as unfair taxes were outlawed. They even passed a law forcing the king to call a parliament at least once every 3 years. Had things stopped there, it's possible war could have been averted. The Houses of Parliament were still united. While his pride had been wounded, Charles didn't yet feel utterly disrespected. But then 2 things came along at once that did to England's chances of peace what a pound of Semtex does to an overstuffed clown car. The first was the impeachment of one of Charles's advisors, during the process of which documents came to light proving that the king had asked the Irish Parliament to raise an army. Now, we already know that army was meant to be used against Scotland, but to jumpy English Puritans, it looked like their Catholic-loving king was raising an Irish Catholic army to oppress them. Now, this led to something from Parliament called the Grand Remonstrance, basically a top 10s listicle of all the things that they really hated did about Charles. However, it's what came next that really set the British Isles on fire. In October 1641, Ireland erupted. In the region of Ulster, Irish natives who'd been oppressed for centuries rose up against their Protestant English and Scottish overlords, killing them. They drove them from their stolen land. As rebellion swept the island, both king and parliament looked on in horror. Unlike with the Scottish Covenanters, there was no English sympathy this time. Everyone agreed something had to be done. An army raised to put down those pesky Irish upstarts. But who would get to raise that army? Remarkably, it would be trying to answer the simple-sounding question that would send England spiraling into war. It's a sign of how low trust had fallen between king and parliament that, even with the Irish in revolt, neither side was willing to let the other raise an army. In his paranoia-soaked mind, Charles was convinced parliament had secretly organised the Scottish Covenanter invasion and would now use any new army to chase him from power. Over in parliament, meanwhile, MPs were whispering that Charles had instigated the Irish rebellion, just so he'd have an excuse to raise an army and crush them all. It was a political standoff, one that could last indefinitely had the king not done something extremely foolish. Fed up with Parliament acting like it was boss, Charles mustered 400 armed men and on January the 4th, 1642, marched to the House of Commons, determined to arrest John Pym and 4 other MPs. It was the first time a reigning king had ever entered the Commons, a slap in the face for parliamentary authority and a direct challenge. Sadly for Charles, it was also a humiliating failure. Pym and the others had been tipped off the night before, and they'd fled into hiding in London. So the king was forced to simply stand there, looking stupid, as he demanded John Pym, and, well, nobody stepped forward. In the end, Charles left empty-handed and bitter. With pro-parliament riots now sweeping London, he and his family fled the capital on January the 10th. With that, the race was on to raise an army for the clearly approaching war. That spring, Parliament passed the Militia Ordinance, basically a fancy piece of legal nonsense, giving it the right to raise an army without the king's consent. Charles, in turn, used something known as the Commissions of Array, an equally fancy piece of nonsense that gave him the right to raise an army without Parliament's consent. By summer 1642, England's nobles were having to decide whose summons to respond to, a decision that was fracturing communities and splitting families. In London, Parliament established a Committee of Safety to run the war and elevated the Earl of Essex to commander its new army. Then on August the 22nd, 1642, Charles raised his standard in Nottingham, a sign for his loyal subjects to flock to his side. And just like that, England was officially at war. Not that you could tell from the outside, though. In this era, there was no such thing as a standing professional army, nor were there many who'd actually witnessed battle. Despite the 30 Years' War having been raging on the continent, most Englishmen had about as much practical experience of warfare as I have of professional wrestling. Is to say not very much. That meant no one, with 1 or 2 important exceptions, really knew how to fight a conflict that didn't involve immediately losing to Scotland. And this was all too evident in the first months, as everyone just kind of pottered around, hoping to bump into each other. Finally, in October, the opposing armies found one another, almost by accident. At Edgehill, on the road to London, the two sides lined up, king and parliament, each fielding around 14,000 men in cavalry. Among these horsemen was 23-year-old Prince Rupert, the Prague-born nephew of Charles I, and one of those important exceptions who really had seen action. Now lined up on the royalist side, Rupert was the king's secret weapon, the guy who was going to win this war before it even got started. Or so Charles hoped. At 3 p.m. on October the 23rd, a cry went up. The two sides facing one another charged, and the Battle of Edgehill, the first battle of the First English Civil War, began. Almost immediately, it became obvious the royalists were going to win, as head of cavalry Rupert smashed Parliament's horsemen, smashed them so bad that they took off running, leaving their infantry exposed for Rupert to destroy at his leisure. It should have been the end, and it probably would have been had Rupert not decided to chase Parliament's fleeing horsemen, leaving the royalists suddenly without backup. With Rupert off the field for literally hours, Parliament managed to fight to an unexpected draw. And so, the big battle that could have ended the war turned out to just be its opening salvo. Not that Charles didn't try to end it anyway. With Parliament's army exhausted, the king marched his men down to London to attack the capital. But an emergency call for militia resulted in 24,000 men mustering to fight back, an army so big, Charles didn't even try to engage them. Instead, the king slunk away to Oxford to establish a new royal capital and bide his time. He probably assumed that the killer blow had simply been delayed until after winter. Instead, the Civil War was doomed to rage on for another 4 years. Although 1642 had given them cautious hope, 1643 would see parliamentary forces given a shellacking. In January, Cromwell fled to the King's Men. In July, Parliament's Western Association army was destroyed, while the vital port city of Bristol was captured. By the First Battle of Newbury in September, the momentum seemed so firmly with the Royalists that they nearly wiped out Parliament's army under the Earl of Essex. It was only a brave stand by a militia unit, combined with the king running out of gunpowder, that allowed them to survive. But while 1643 might have been Parliament's annus horribilis, it does give us a good excuse to talk about someone really important to today's story. Thomas Fairfax. A Yorkshire-based aristocrat in his early 30s, Fairfax and his dad were some of the only people in the north not to take the king's side. Instead, they commanded Parliament's Northern Army, an army which, like most on the side of the Roundheads, suffered a string of defeats in 1643. Defeats which culminated with the Fairfaxes retreating into the city of Hull and fortifying it. It was a close call. Thomas was shot through the wrist in the retreat and he nearly bled out. But they made it. And once inside Hull, they launched raids across Yorkshire, stopping the Northern Royalists from marching south to reinforce the king. But that wasn't enough for Fairfax. That September, he slipped out of Hull and joined Parliament's Eastern Association army. It was while serving with them that he found a skilled cavalry officer, a former farmer turned MP and die-hard Puritan who'd witnessed Prince Rupert throw away victory at the Battle of Edgehill and was determined to learn from his enemies' mistakes. That Puritan's name, of course, was Oliver Cromwell. Together, he and Fairfax were going to make history. But first, we need to watch the war's ripple effects swamp Charles's other two kingdoms. While everyone's attention had been on England, the rebellion in Ireland had been gunning for nearly a year, metamorphosing into a sprawling conflict known as the Confederate Wars. This whole time, the English garrisons had been waiting for reinforcements that never came. In September 1643, though, the king's representative cut a deal. In return for letting English troops leave Ireland to fight for the king, they would agree to a 1-year ceasefire with the Irish rebels. When Parliament got wind of that deal, they collectively crapped their pantaloons. Worried this ceasefire was really an excuse for Charles to call over that massive Irish Catholic army that they were still worried about, they decided they needed an ally of their own, sharpish. The obvious choice? Scotland. Just weeks after Charles's Irish ceasefire, Parliament signed the Solemn League and Covenant, a deal which basically promised that if Scotland helped them win the war, England would convert to the Covenanters' Presbyterian faith. Now, if that sounds like small potatoes, you've got to remember what a huge deal religion is at this time in history. Pretty much everyone literally believes they're fighting in God's name. So Parliament's promise was more than enough. In January 1644, a Covenanter army, over 20,000 strong, invaded England. In London, a joint committee of both kingdoms was formed to direct the war effort. And just like that, it was the Royalists' turn to have a dreadful year. The arrival of the Scots combined with a series of other parliamentary victories to send the tide of war sweeping in the other direction. Starting in December 1643, Thomas Fairfax began a rampage across the north, in which town after town just fell to his forces. By spring, he'd pushed the Northern Royalists into the city of York and laid siege to it. Down in Oxford, a panicked Charles tried to quickly regain legitimacy by calling a new Royalist parliament. But even this uber-loyal chamber became too much for him, and he wound up, you guessed it, dissolving it twice. So, that's drink 5 and 6 for anyone still playing. Meanwhile, with York about to fall, Prince Rupert dashed north to help. By the time he arrived, on July 2nd, 1644, Fairfax's army had linked up with a major Scottish Covenanter force to Voltron together a powerful army. Outnumbered, Rupert probably should have turned and fled, but he believed he'd been ordered to fight. So fight he did. That evening, the two sides lined up at Marston Moor. Around 7:30 p.m., a huge thunderstorm broke out over the battlefield. Assuming they would have to wait until the next day to fight, Rupert retired to his quarters. He'd barely got there when a shout went up. On the field, Parliament's forces surged forwards through the rain. It was the beginning of the Battle of Marston Moor, perhaps the biggest battle ever fought on English soil. It was also the battle that would take Parliament's victory from an impossibility to a near certainty. If anyone in Parliament privately harboured doubts about Fairfax and Cromwell, they were dispelled that stormy day on Marston Moor. After crashing through the Royalist cavalry on his flank, Cromwell executed an insane manoeuvre, looping around the back of enemy lines. In a coordinated move with Fairfax, he then came crashing into their other flank like a divine thunderbolt flashing out of a clear sky. The impact of the charge was so great, the Royalist lines basically crumbled. 2 hours after it started, as dusk set, the fight was over. 4,000 Royalists lay dead, another 1,500 had been taken prisoner. All their gunpowder and weapons had been captured. By contrast, the combined Parliamentary and Covenanter armies lost a mere 300 men. It was one of the most decisive victories of the war, the sort of royal defeat John Pym could have only dreamed of back when Charles demanded his arrest. Sadly, Pym didn't live to see it. He died of cancer mere months earlier, robbing Parliament of its leading light. Although it wouldn't be long before Cromwell decided to take his job. In the aftermath of Marston Moor, the Royalist stronghold of York fell, ending Charles's power in the north. Unfortunately, though, it didn't quite end the king himself, because fate was about to throw Charles a lifesaver. Or rather, two lifesavers. The first was the Earl of Essex's incredible screw-up. Always a somewhat unimpressive commander, Essex was also Parliament's biggest egotist. In September, he marched his army into Cornwall, hoping to show off by capturing the county. What actually happened, though, was his army got surrounded and destroyed, had lost with the Earl, and Essex himself only narrowly escaped with his life. But while this was good news for Charles, it wasn't the best he heard that autumn. No, that came when the Marquis of Montrose marched into Scotland, hooked up with an Irish army, and proceeded to unleash hell on the Covenanters. Now, the ins and outs of how a pro-royalist Irish force came to be invading Scotland in 1644 is complicated, involving clan feuds and exiled Scottish landowners in Ireland who were desperate for revenge. The upshot is that Montrose was able to use this army to not just smash up a few towns, but do so much damage that it took Scotland to the brink of conquest. The result? By 1645, the Covenanter army had fled England to protect its home, leaving Parliament without its most powerful army. Parliament, at Cromwell's suggestion, hastily drew plans for a powerful army of its own, a new army that would be a model of its kind, one staffed with well-paid professionals, ruled by iron discipline, and versed in the newest tactics. We're talking, of course, about the New Model Army. Formed in February 1645, the New Model Army was the first national standing army in British history. Under the command of Thomas Fairfax, it had uniforms, no regional affiliations, and a meritocratic system that, unusually for the era, saw talented commoners like the brewer Thomas Pride promoted all the way to officers. It also had no politicians among its ranks. With Parliament now split into war and peace factions, there were fears some parliamentary commanders were holding back to increase the chance of a negotiated settlement. So, the war faction pushed through something called the Self-Denying Ordinance, forbidding any sitting members from serving in the New Model Army. The big exception was Oliver Cromwell, who was just so damn good at fighting, they couldn't afford to lose him. Instead, he became Fairfax's second-in-command. With that done, the New Model Army was at last ready to win the war. That May, Prince Rupert stormed Leicester, sacking the city. In response, Fairfax marched his army north. On June the 14th, the two sides met at the Battle of Naseby. On one side, up to 10,000 cavaliers under the command of a talented but hot-headed prince. On the other, a 14,000-strong professional army commanded by the two greatest military minds of their generation. You can probably guess what happens next. The Battle of Naseby was basically a sustained royalist slaughter that saw most of Rupert's army destroyed, all his artillery captured, and a wagon carrying the king's private correspondence seized. So total was the defeat that it left Charles with almost no soldiers to his name. And just like that, it had happened. The unthinkable had become possible. A king who everyone believed had been placed on the throne by God himself had effectively been defeated. It would take another year for the war to limp to its conclusion, but there was now no doubting it. In the battle for England's soul, Parliament had won, and that meant nobody had any idea what should happen next. The months following Naseby were a reel of non-stop misery for England's royalists, like being forced to watch a depressing movie where you already know the end. The New Model Army marched southwest, smashing the last royalist strongholds one by one, retaking cities like Bristol and forcing the surrender of Cornwall. If that wasn't bad enough, up in Scotland, the Marquis of Montrose was finally defeated at the Battle of Philpot. This freed the Covenanter army to march back into England and lay siege to one of the last royalist cities at Newark, although the Covenanters weren't quite so enthusiastic anymore. As the war dragged on, radical new social movements were starting to spring up, affecting Parliament's thinking. One of the most radical being the idea of religious toleration, of allowing different forms of Protestant worship across England. This gelled badly with the Covenanters' hopes of installing Presbyterian worship across the British Isles, so much so that it would become a driving factor in the Second English Civil War. For now, though, the alliance between Parliament and the Scots held. On March the 21st, the last Royalist army was defeated in the field. That left only Charles's new capital, Oxford, for Parliament to conquer. That April, the New Model Army began its long march across the south to besiege the city. The knowledge that a highly trained, highly motivated force was heading his way and no one could stop them seems to have forced the king to finally accept the bitter truth. On April the 27th, he fled the city in disguise just ahead of Fairfax and Cromwell, armed only with a last desperate plan to avoid capture by Parliament by throwing himself on the mercy of the Scots. The siege of Oxford began on May the 3rd. 2 days later, Charles handed himself over to the Covenanter army and surrendered. At last, on June the 24th, 1646, Oxford fell to the New Model Army, and with that, the First English Civil War was over. Of course, though, the larger conflict wasn't anywhere near done, not even close. Ireland was still deep in its own set of wars. With the king now in Scottish captivity, tensions were already starting to rise between Parliament and the Covenanters. Perhaps more importantly, though, no one had yet decided what defeating the king actually meant. Would Charles stay on his throne after a peace deal? Had the English Civil War just been fought over the rights of Parliament, or for religious reasons, or for what? And now that the chaos had started to unleash new radical movements, what would the future of the three kingdoms look like? But these are all questions that are going to have to wait for our next chapter. For now, let's end today by noting that the war had done the impossible. It had taken a king and laid him low, not by having another royal knock him off his pedestal, but by a bunch of upstart commoners. It was a new chapter in English history, something that had never happened before. And figuring out what to do next would lead not just to more bloodshed, but to regicide, revolution, and the transformation of all three British kingdoms.